The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glare over the crowd. Rows of benches creaked under the weight of observers, murmurs spreading like wildfire as the judge prepared to call the next case. At the heart of it all stood Malia, an 11-year-old black girl clutching a small notebook. Her hair was neatly braided, her eyes wide but determined. She looked impossibly small against the grandeur of the courtroom, dwarfed by the imposing figure of Officer Brent Halstead, a seasoned white cop whose reputation preceded him. Halstead had earned a name for being tough on crime, but to many in the community it was code for something far darker. He towered at the defendant's table, arms crossed, his face a mask of disdain as he glanced sideways at Malia. This was no ordinary court case. Malia, an aspiring young artist, had been working on a chalk mural on a public sidewalk in her neighborhood. It depicted a hopeful image of unity, a black child and a white child holding hands beneath a rainbow. It was supposed to be for the community art fair, but Halstead had stormed onto the scene, accusing her of vandalism. What followed were accusations, insults, and an encounter that left Malia shaken, but not broken. Today, Malia was representing herself in court. Her parents, though supportive, had agreed to let her take the lead. She wanted to fight this battle on her own terms, and they believed in her enough to let her try. The judge called her name. Malia rose from her seat, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands, and began walking toward the podium. The murmurs in the courtroom died down. All eyes were on her. "You've got to be kidding me," Halstead muttered under his breath, loud enough for the nearest spectators to hear. A faint chuckle rippled through his supporters. Malia didn't flinch. Instead, she stood tall as her 4'9" frame would allow, and adjusted the microphone. "Good afternoon, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but clear. "My name is Malia Jones, and I'm here to defend my art and my rights." The room fell silent again. Even the judge raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the poise of the young girl before him. "Proceed," he said, leaning slightly forward in his chair. Malia opened her notebook. Her first words sent a ripple of curiosity through the courtroom, setting the stage for a confrontation no one would forget. Malia took a deep breath and scanned the room. The sea of faces blurred for a moment, but she focused on the judge's steady gaze. It was her anchor. She flipped to the first page of her notebook and began. "Your Honor, before I explain what happened, I want to tell you what my mural was supposed to represent. I called it Together We Rise. It's about community, about people working together no matter their differences. It's about hope. I thought it was something my neighborhood could use." Her voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on. But Officer Halstead didn't see it that way. Halstead leaned back in his chair, smirking. He looked as if he were watching a bad comedy, arms crossed and one eyebrow raised. The judge nodded for her to continue. "On the day I was arrested," she said, her voice growing stronger, "I was working on my mural, just like I told everyone I would at the community art meeting." Officer Halstead drove by and stopped. At first I thought he wanted to look at what I was making. But then he got out of his car, and the first thing he said was, "What do you think you're doing here, girl?" Gasps rippled through the audience, though some spectators shifted uncomfortably, trying to hide smirks. Malia didn't let the reaction distract her. She kept her focus on the judge. "I told him I was working on my mural. I even showed him the permit the city gave me. But he didn't look at it. Instead, he told me that people like me didn't belong in his part of town, and that I needed to pack up and leave." Halstead's smirk faded slightly, and a faint blush crept up his neck. "I was scared," Malia admitted, her voice softening. "But I wasn't going to let him scare me off. I told him I had permission to be there, and that's when he grabbed the chalk out of my hand, threw it on the ground, and said I was defacing public property." Halstead's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, whispering something to the officer, but Halstead waved him off. The judge interjected. "Did you have a permit for the mural, young lady?" "Yes, Your Honor," Malia replied confidently. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her notebook. Here it is. Signed by the city council, the judge leaned forward to examine the document. His eyebrows furrowed as he read it, then he nodded. It appears to be valid. Officer Halstead, did you see this permit when you approached Miss Jones? Halstead coughed awkwardly, his smirk now fully gone. I don't recall seeing it, Your Honor. It was chaotic. Malia didn't miss a beat. Chaotic? I was drawing a rainbow. With chalk, laughter erupted from the audience, though the judge quickly banged his gavel to restore order. Halstead shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the cracks in his confidence beginning to show. Malia continued, her voice steady now. He called me a vandal, arrested me in front of my friends, and had me taken to the station. I sat there for hours, crying, while my parents were called. All for something I was allowed to do. The tension in the room was palpable. Even those who had initially sided with Halstead began to exchange uneasy glances. Malia closed her notebook and looked directly at the officer. You didn't arrest me because of what I did. You arrested me because of what I look like. The courtroom froze. Halstead opened his mouth to speak but quickly shut it again, his lawyer tugging on his sleeve. Malia's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, waiting to erupt. The silence was deafening. For a moment it seemed as though the entire courtroom was holding its breath. Malia didn't waver. She stood firm, her small frame radiating a strength that even the most seasoned lawyers in the room couldn't muster. Halstead finally broke the silence, his voice dripping with condescension. Your Honor, with all due respect, this is ridiculous. We're really going to sit here and take the word of a child who doesn't understand the law. She was vandalizing city property, plain and simple. Malia tilted her head, studying him like she was observing a strange insect under a magnifying glass. Officer Halstead, she said calmly, do you think I don't know the law because I'm a child or because I'm black? Gasps rippled through the room again, louder this time. Even the judge leaned back slightly, his face a mix of intrigue and caution. Halstead's face flushed crimson. That's not I didn't, he stammered, searching for the right words. Malia pressed on, her tone as sharp as a razor. Because I know plenty about the law. For example, I know that public art is protected under my permit, which you ignored. I know that chalk art, especially non-permanent chalk, isn't considered vandalism under city code. And I know that I was treated differently because you didn't think I belonged in that neighborhood. The spectators began to murmur. Halstead's lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but the officer waved him off again, his jaw tightening. The judge raised his hand to silence the room. Miss Jones, do you have evidence to support these claims? This is a serious accusation. Malia nodded. Yes, Your Honor. I brought witnesses. Halstead's smirk returned, albeit shakier than before. Witnesses? Who? Her little friends who were drawing hopscotch on the sidewalk. This time the judge didn't hide his disapproval. Officer Halstead, I would advise you to watch your tone, he said sternly. Malia remained unflustered. Actually, Your Honor, I have statements from 3 local residents who saw everything. 2 of them are white, and they all said the same thing. Officer Halstead didn't even look at my permit before accusing me of vandalism. And 1 of them recorded the whole thing. The courtroom erupted into chaos. People whispered, gasped, and craned their necks to get a better look at Malia, who stood perfectly still, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. Halstead visibly stiffened, his eyes narrowing as he glared at her. The judge banged his gavel. Order in the court. Miss Jones, is this recording available for review? Malia nodded and held up a flash drive. Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to submit it as evidence. Halstead's lawyer sprang to his feet. Objection. This recording could have been tampered with. The judge cut him off. I'll determine that. Bailiff, please retrieve the flash drive. The bailiff took the device from Malia and inserted it into a laptop connected to the courtroom's projector. The screen flickered to life, displaying a shaky but clear video of the incident. In the recording, Halstead could be heard shouting, "You people think you can do whatever you want here. Not in my neighborhood." The courtroom collectively sucked in a breath. Halstead's lawyer slumped in his chair, covering his face with one hand. The officer's expression turned stone-cold, his jaw twitching. Malia stepped back from the podium, her work done for the moment. The video continued to play, showing her calm attempts to explain and Halstead's escalating aggression. The evidence was damning, and everyone in the room knew it. The judge paused the video, his face grim. "Officer Halstead, do you care to explain this behavior?" Halstead shifted in his seat, his bravado cracking under the weight of the evidence. "Your Honor, I was just doing my job. I didn't mean for it to come off that way." The judge raised an eyebrow. "You didn't mean for your words to come off that way." "What way?" "Officer." "'Cause they seem quite clear to me." Malia watched silently, her expression unreadable. She knew this was just the beginning. Halstead wasn't going to admit fault easily, and the battle was far from over. But she had made her first major move, and the courtroom was beginning to see the truth. She glanced at her parents in the crowd. They smiled at her, their pride evident. Malia turned back to face the judge, ready for whatever came next. The judge's stern expression didn't waver as he addressed Halstead again. "Officer, the words you used and your actions depicted in this video don't align with the conduct expected from law enforcement. You claim to have been doing your job, but your job isn't to intimidate or humiliate citizens, especially not children. Do you have anything further to say in your defense?" Halstead shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly grasping for a way out. "Your Honor, the situation was tense. I saw what I thought was vandalism, and I acted to preserve public property. Maybe I didn't handle it the best way, but I stand by my intentions." Malia's calm voice cut through the tension. "Your intentions, Officer Halstead, weren't to protect public property. They were to remind me that I don't belong in certain places." The officer snapped his head toward her, his composure cracking. "That's ridiculous." "You don't know what I was thinking." Malia smiled faintly, not out of amusement but out of quiet determination. "You're right, I don't know exactly what you were thinking. But your words and actions made it pretty clear. You said, 'You people think you can do whatever you want here.' Who are you people, Officer Halstead?" The courtroom was silent again, save for the rustling of papers and the faint creak of chairs as spectators leaned forward, eager to hear his response. Halstead's face burned red, and for the first time he hesitated. Roman, too, didn't mean it like that. He stammered, his tone defensive. The judge interjected, his voice sharp. "Then what did you mean, Officer Halstead?" "Because the court would certainly like to know." Halstead's lawyer stood up, clearly desperate to regain control of the spiraling situation. "Your Honor, I must reiterate that my client's actions were based on his duty to protect public property and maintain order. The language he used may have been regrettable, but it was not racially motivated." Malia's hand shot up politely, and the judge gestured for her to speak. "Your Honor, may I share something else?" The judge nodded. "Proceed, Miss Jones." Malia flipped to another page in her notebook and held it up for the court to see. It was a photo of her mural before it was ruined, vibrant, colorful, and unmistakably hopeful. "This is what I was working on," she said. "Does this look like something that would make a trained officer think the situation was tense or dangerous?" Halstead's lawyer opened his mouth to object, but Malia continued before he could. "This mural wasn't graffiti. It wasn't vandalism. It was meant to bring people together, and I had permission to make it. But Officer Halstead didn't care about any of that because he saw me as a problem first. The black girl with chalk." Her words landed like a hammer, and murmurs rippled through the room once more. Some spectators nodded in agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not saying all cops are bad," Malia added, her voice steady. "I'm saying that this cop treated me differently because of how I look. And that's not just unfair, it's dangerous." The judge leaned forward, clasping his hands. Officer Halstead, do you deny that your actions were influenced by racial bias? Halstead's lawyer tried to step in again, but the judge held up a hand to silence him. The officer was on his own. I don't believe I acted out of bias, Your Honor, Halstead said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. I was just trying to do my job. Malia spoke up again, her tone calm but unyielding. Then why did you destroy my chalk and call me you people? If you were just doing your job, wouldn't you have looked at my permit first? The officer didn't respond. His jaw tightened, his silence speaking volumes. The judge sighed, his patience wearing thin. Miss Jones, I'm impressed by your composure and the evidence you've presented so far. Officer Halstead, this court is not here to excuse regrettable behavior. We're here to determine whether your actions were justified or driven by something far more troubling. For now, we will proceed to review the testimonies and statements Miss Jones has provided. The courtroom buzzed as the judge called for a recess. Spectators whispered among themselves, many of them casting side glances at Halstead. The cracks in his confidence were widening, and everyone could feel it. Malia returned to her seat beside her parents, who squeezed her hands proudly. "You're doing amazing, sweetheart," her mother whispered. But Malia's focus never wavered. She knew the fight wasn't over yet. Halstead might have been cornered, but she wasn't here for just a small victory. She was here for the Trutan justice. When the court reconvened, the tension was thicker than ever. The judge called for the witnesses Malia had mentioned. One by one they took the stand, each recounting the events of that day with remarkable consistency. The first witness was Mrs. Henderson, a white woman in her 60s who lived across the street from the mural site. She adjusted her glasses nervously before speaking. "I was on my porch when I saw Officer Halstead pull up," she began. "At first I thought he was just checking in. It's not unusual for him to patrol the area. But then I saw him yelling at Malia. He didn't even ask her any questions before grabbing her chalk and throwing it on the ground. I remember thinking that poor girl didn't do anything wrong." Halstead's lawyer stood up, trying to poke holes in her account. "Mrs. Henderson, are you absolutely sure you saw Officer Halstead throw the chalk? Could it not have been an accident in the heat of the moment?" Mrs. Henderson's lips tightened. "It wasn't an accident." He was angry, and he made it very clear that he didn't think Malia should be there. The second witness, Mr. Patel, a middle-aged store owner from down the street, was equally compelling. "I've run my business here for 15 years, he said. "I've seen kids draw with chalk on that sidewalk 100 times, shopscotch, smiley faces, whatever. No one's ever cared. But this time the officer seemed determined to make an example out of her. It didn't feel right." Halstead's lawyer tried again. "Mr. Patel, could it be that Officer Halstead was simply enforcing the law? Perhaps he was unaware of the permit." Patel shook his head. "He didn't even ask about a permit. Malia showed it to him, and he didn't even look at it. He just said something about you people and started shouting." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Halstead's expression grew darker, his hands clenching into fists beneath the table. The final witness was a teenager named Sarah, who had been recording the incident from her phone. She was the one who had provided the video evidence earlier. "I live a few blocks away," she said. "I was walking my dog when I saw what was happening. At first I thought it was just a misunderstanding, but then I heard what Officer Halstead said, and I knew I had to record it. The way he was treating her, it wasn't right." The judge leaned forward. "Miss Sarah, why did you feel compelled to record the incident?" Sarah hesitated, glancing at Malia before answering. "Because I've seen things like this happen before. People don't always believe kids, especially kids like Malia. I wanted to make sure there was proof." Her words hung heavy in the air. The judge nodded solemnly, thanking her for her testimony. Halstead's lawyer looked increasingly desperate as he stood. "Your Honor, these are all personal accounts. None of this proves my client's actions were motivated by bias. At best, it suggests he may have acted hastily, but before the judge could respond, Malia stood up again. Your Honor, may I say something? The judge looked at her thoughtfully. You may. Malia turned to face the courtroom, her voice steady and clear. I'm not here to destroy Officer Halstead's career. I'm here because I believe that people in positions of power should be held accountable for their actions. If we let this slide, if we let him get away with treating me this way just because I'm young and black, then it sends a message that this kind of behavior is okay. And it's not. Her words struck a chord with the audience. Even some of Halstead's supporters shifted uncomfortably, their earlier confidence in him visibly shaken. The judge nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Thank you, Miss Jones. I believe we have enough evidence and testimony to proceed. Halstead's lawyer rose again, his tone more subdued now. Your Honor, I would request a moment to consult with my client before we continue. The judge granted a brief recess, and the courtroom buzzed with speculation. Malia sat quietly with her parents, her focus unwavering. Do you think he'll admit it? Her father asked softly. Malia shook her head. I don't know. But I'm not stopping until the truth comes out. From across the room Halstead glared at her, his composure unraveling. For the first time, it seemed as though he was beginning to realize the gravity of the situation. When the court reconvened, the tension in the room was almost tangible. Officer Halstead returned to his seat, his face rigid and unreadable. His lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, gesturing toward the growing pile of evidence against him. But Halstead waved him off again, his pride refusing to bend. The judge glanced at the clock and addressed the room. Before we proceed to closing arguments, I'd like to ask Officer Halstead one more time, is there any aspect of this case you would like to clarify or contest, particularly regarding the video and the witness testimonies? Halstead stood, his movements stiff. His face betrayed a mix of anger and unease. Your Honor, he began, his voice low but firm, I didn't mean to upset anyone. My job is to maintain order, and sometimes that means making quick decisions. I've worked this community for years, and I've seen how things can get out of hand. I wasn't targeting her because of her race or age. I was trying to prevent a situation from escalating. Malia rose to her feet, her calm voice cutting through the officer's statement like a blade. Escalating into what, Officer Halstead? A rainbow riot. The courtroom erupted in muffled laughter and gasps. Even the judge raised an eyebrow at the sharpness of her remark. Halstead's composure cracked for a split second, a flash of anger crossing his face. This isn't funny, he snapped, his voice louder than intended. You don't understand what it's like to do this job, to always be on alert. Malia tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. You're right, I don't know what it's like to be a cop. But I do know what it's like to be treated unfairly. And I know the difference between someone trying to help and someone using their power to hurt. Halstead's lawyer jumped in, sensing the danger of letting his client continue. Your Honor, I'd like to redirect the focus to the permit in question, and whether it was clearly visible at the time of the incident. This is about a misunderstanding, not malice. Malia's voice rang out again before the judge could respond. Your Honor, may I ask Officer Halstead a question? The judge looked intrigued. You may. Malia turned to face Halstead directly, her small frame impossibly commanding. Officer Halstead, you said you've worked in this community for years. Have you ever stopped any of the other kids who have drawn with chalk on that sidewalk? The ones who don't look like me? The question hit like a thunderclap. Halstead hesitated, the color draining from his face. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his lawyer for guidance, but none came. I don't recall, he said finally, his voice faltering. Malia didn't let up. You don't recall, or it never happened. Because I've lived in this neighborhood my whole life, and I've never seen you stop anyone else. Just me. Just this once. Why is that? The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Spectators leaned forward, hanging on every word. Even the judge's expression hardened as he turned his attention to the officer. Halstead clenched his jaw, his hands gripping the edges of the table. "Look, I can't keep track of every kid with chalk," he said, his tone defensive. "Maybe I made a mistake, but it wasn't about race." Malia nodded slowly, as though considering his words. Then, with a faint smile, she delivered her final blow. "But you didn't just make a mistake. You destroyed my work, arrested me, and humiliated me in front of my friends. All because, in your words, people like me don't belong. That doesn't sound like a mistake. That sounds like a choice." The room fell into a stunned silence. Halstead's lawyer slumped in his seat, his attempts at damage control obliterated by Malia's unwavering logic. The judge rubbed his temple, his expression a mix of frustration and thoughtfulness. "Officer Halstead, the evidence and testimony presented here suggest a troubling pattern of behavior. Whether you admit it or not, your actions went far beyond what was necessary or appropriate for the situation." Halstead looked like he wanted to argue, but thought better of it. His face was tight with frustration, but he remained silent. Malia returned to her seat, her calm demeanor unbroken. Her parents smiled at her, their pride radiating from them like a beacon. Malia didn't smile back. Her focus remained on the judge, knowing the fight wasn't over yet. The judge leaned forward. "We will now move to closing arguments. Miss Jones, as the complainant, you may proceed first." Malia stood again, her small figure standing tall against the weight of the room. She opened her notebook one last time, ready to deliver the final piece of her case. Malia stood at the podium, her notebook open, though she barely glanced at it. The room was silent, every eye fixed on her. She took a deep breath and began. "Your Honor, I'm just a kid," she started, her voice clear but soft. "I don't know everything about the law, and I'm not pretending to. But what I do know is that there's a difference between protecting people and hurting them. What Officer Halstead did that day wasn't about keeping anyone safe. It was about control." She paused, letting her words settle in the air before continuing. "When he saw me, he didn't see an artist or a kid who was trying to make something beautiful. He saw a problem, and instead of talking to me, instead of asking questions, he decided that I didn't belong and that he had to make me leave." Malia's gaze swept the room, landing on the judge, the jury, and finally Officer Halstead. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been treated like they're less than, just because of how they look. It's about making sure people who are supposed to protect us don't abuse their power." The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. The room was completely still, as though the entire courtroom was holding its breath. Malia turned toward the audience. "I'm not angry at Officer Halstead. I'm disappointed. I thought grown-ups, especially people with badges, were supposed to be better than this. They are supposed to set an example. But what example did he set that day? That it's okay to judge someone without knowing anything about them. That it's okay to take away their voice just because you can." She looked down at her notebook for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts, then closed it. "Your Honor, I don't want revenge. I don't even want an apology if it isn't real. What I want is for this to matter. For people like Officer Halstead to think twice before they use their power to silence someone. For kids like me to know that we have a voice, and that we can use Eitvan when it feels like no one's listening." Her final words hit the room like a wave. The audience murmured, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Even those who had come in support of Halstead seemed subdued, their earlier confidence shaken. Malia stepped back from the podium and returned to her seat. Her parents each placed a hand on her shoulders, their pride evident. The judge cleared his throat, glancing at his notes before turning to Halstead's lawyer. "The defense may now present their closing argument." Halstead's lawyer stood, clearly rattled by the emotional weight of Malia's words. His usual smooth demeanor was gone, replaced by a forced calmness. He addressed the room, his voice steady but lacking conviction. "Your Honor, members of the court," he began, "this case is a misunderstanding that has been blown out of proportion. Officer Halstead was acting in what he believed to be the best interest of the community. While his words and actions may not have been ideal, there is no definitive proof that his intent was racially motivated." He glanced at Malia but quickly looked away, as if her quiet confidence unnerved him. "We urge the court to consider the pressures of law enforcement and the need for officers to make quick decisions in unpredictable situations. Officer Halstead made a mistake, but it was not a malicious one." The lawyer sat down quickly, clearly eager to escape the scrutiny of the room. The judge nodded and addressed the court. "Thank you. I will now take some time to deliberate before delivering my verdict." Court is adjourned for a brief recess. As the judge exited the room, the courtroom buzzed with conversation. Reporters whispered furiously into their recorders, spectators debated in hushed tones, and Halstead sat rigidly at the defense table, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. Malia sat quietly between her parents, her face calm but focused. Her father leaned in. "You were incredible, Malia. No matter what happens next, you've already won." But Malia shook her head slightly. "Not yet," she said softly, her eyes fixed on the door where the judge had exited. "It's not over yet." From across the room Halstead glanced at her, his expression dark and conflicted. It was clear that her words had struck a nerve, though whether they had reached his heart remained to be seen. As the minutes ticked by, the weight of the moment pressed down on everyone in the room. When the judge returned, the room fell silent once more. This was it moment of truth. The judge returned to the bench, his face unreadable as he shuffled his papers. The courtroom settled into a heavy silence, anticipation crackling like static in the air. Halstead sat rigidly, his lawyer beside him looking increasingly pale. Malia, calm but focused, leaned forward slightly, her small hands folded in her lap. The judge began, his voice measured. "This court has reviewed the evidence, including the video recording, the witness testimonies, and the permit provided by Miss Jones. We've also considered the conduct of Officer Halstead on the day in question and his statements in this courtroom." He paused, letting the weight of his words linger before continuing. "It is clear that Officer Halstead acted inappropriately. His words and actions went beyond what is acceptable for someone in his position of authority. The evidence strongly suggests that his conduct was influenced, consciously or unconsciously, by racial bias. This court cannot ignore such behavior." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room, but the judge banged his gavel lightly to restore order. "However," the judge continued, his gaze shifting to Malia, "I must commend Miss Jones for her remarkable composure, intelligence, and bravery in bringing this matter to light. It is not easy for anyone, let alone an Alevon, Yarol, to stand up to authority in the pursuit of justice. You have demonstrated a level of strength and maturity that is rare, and this court is better for having heard your voice." Malia's parents beamed with pride, but Malia remained focused, her expression unreadable. The judge turned his attention back to Halstead. "Officer Halstead, your actions have not only harmed Miss Jones, but have also damaged the trust this community places in its law enforcement. That trust is fragile, and it is your duty to uphold it, not to undermine it. Therefore, this court recommends disciplinary action, including mandatory sensitivity and anti-bias training. Additionally, your record will reflect this incident, and your actions will be subject to review by your department." Halstead's face tightened, but he remained silent, his lawyer placing a calming hand on his arm. The judge wasn't finished. "Miss Jones, while the court cannot undo the harm you've experienced, I am ordering that any record of your arrest be expunged immediately. Furthermore, I am requesting that the City Council formally recognize your mural project and allow you to complete it without interference. It is clear that your work is not only legal but a valuable contribution to this community." The room buzzed with mixed reactions, some cheers of support from Malia, others muttered protests from Halstead's supporters. The judge banged his gavel again, silencing the room. Before the court could adjourn, Malia raised her hand. "Your Honor, may I say one last thing?" The judge looked at her curiously but nodded. "Of course, Miss Jones." Malia stood, turning to face Halstead directly. Her voice was calm but firm. "Officer Halstead, I hope you understand that this isn't just about what you did to me. It's about making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. You have power, and with that power comes responsibility. I'm not asking you to like me or even agree with me, but I am asking you to think before you act, because your actions have consequences for me, for the people you're supposed to protect, and for yourself." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Halstead's jaw tightened, and for a moment it looked as though he might snap back. But then his shoulders sagged slightly, and he looked down at the table in front of him. The judge nodded, clearly impressed. "Thank you, Miss Jones. Court is adjourned." The gavel's final bang echoed through the room, and the courtroom erupted into noise. Reporters swarmed toward Malia and her parents, microphones thrust forward as questions were shouted over the din. "Miss Jones, how does it feel to win? Do you think Officer Halstead will change his ways? What will you do next?" Malia smiled politely but stayed close to her parents. "I'll answer questions later," she said, her voice steady but weary. "Right now I just want to go home." As they made their way out of the courtroom, Malia glanced back one last time. Halstead was still seated at the defense table, his expression a mix of anger, shame, and something that might have been reflection. Malia didn't wait to see more. She had done her part, and she knew the fight for justice didn't end here. But for today she had won, and the lesson she had delivered would linger long after the courtroom emptied. As Malia and her family stepped into the courthouse lobby, the atmosphere outside was electric. A crowd of supporters had gathered, holding signs with messages like "Justice for Malia and Art is not a crime." Cheers erupted as Malia appeared, though she shrank back slightly, uncomfortable with the attention. Her mother knelt beside her, brushing a braid away from her face. "You did it, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft but filled with pride. Malia nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips. "I didn't just do it for me. I did it for everyone." The family made their way through the throng of reporters and supporters, heading toward the car waiting to take them home. Along the way, an older black woman stopped them. Her eyes were misty as she reached out to Malia. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice trembling. "What you did today, it's going to make a difference. For my grandkids. For all of us." Malia looked up at the woman, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you," she said simply. "But it's not over yet. We all have to keep going." The woman nodded, squeezing Malia's hand before stepping back into the crowd. Meanwhile, inside the courtroom, Halstead remained seated, staring blankly at the table in front of him. His lawyer had already gathered his papers and left, but Halstead didn't move. The weight of the day's events seemed to settle on him all at once, and for the first time he looked less like a proud officer and more like a man coming to terms with his own flaws. The murmurs of the courtroom echoed in his ears, the testimonies, the judge's reprimand, and most of all, Malia's words. "Think before you act. Your actions have consequences." He sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his face. His career wasn't over, but his reputation was damaged, and he knew it. Worse, he couldn't ignore the growing voice in his head, whispering that maybe just maybe been wrong. Outside, Malia's family reached their car, her parents ushering her inside as the crowd continued to cheer. Before the door closed, Malia turned to look back at the courthouse. It stood tall and imposing, its marble facade gleaming in the afternoon sun. "Are you okay?" her father asked gently, turning to look at her in the back seat. Malia nodded slowly. "Yeah," she said. "I just hope he learned something." Her mother glanced at her in the rearview mirror, her eyes filled with love. "You did everything you could. The rest is up to him." As the car pulled away, Malia leaned her head against the window, watching the city blur past. She felt a strange mixture of pride and exhaustion. The battle she'd fought today wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or judged unfairly. For the first time since the ordeal began, she allowed herself to breathe. She had spoken her truth, and the world had listened. Now it was up to others to carry that truth forward. But as she closed her eyes and the hum of the car lulled her, she knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning of her fight for justice. She was just getting started. The sun dipped lower in the sky as Malia's car disappeared into the city streets, leaving the courthouse and its echoes behind. Yet inside the building, the day's events continued to reverberate. Officer Halstead, now alone in the courtroom, finally rose from his seat. The once-confident swagger that had marked his demeanor was gone. He walked slowly toward the door, his footsteps heavy, as though each one carried the weight of his choices. As he reached the exit, he paused, catching sight of the mural permit Malia had presented, still lying on the judge's bench. He stared at it for a moment, the small, creased paper a stark reminder of what he'd dismissed so easily. A voice broke his reverie. "Officer Halstead." He turned to see the judge standing nearby, his robes draped over one arm as he prepared to leave. The older man regarded Halstead with a measured gaze. "Take this as a wake-up call," the judge said evenly. "You're in a position of trust, but trust can be lost much faster than it's earned. Think carefully about how you use the authority you've been given. People like Malia are watching, and they deserve better." Halstead nodded, though his throat felt too tight to respond. The judge left without another word, leaving him alone once more. Outside, Malia's family reached their modest home, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard. As soon as she stepped out of the car, Malia made her way to the front porch and sat down, pulling her notebook onto her lap. Her father joined her, sitting on the step below. "What are you working on?" he asked, nodding toward the notebook. Malia smiled faintly. "A new mural idea," she said. "Something about today." He tilted his head, curious. "What will it say?" She thought for a moment, then wrote something in bold letters across the top of the page. Her father leaned in to read it. "Truth is power." Malia looked up at him, her eyes bright with determination. "I want people to see it, and remember that standing up for what's right matters. Even if it's scary. Even if it's hard." Her father smiled, his pride shining through. "I think that's perfect," he said. The family spent the evening together, the stress of the day melting away into the warmth of home. But even as Malia laughed with her parents and sketched her new mural ideas, she felt a deep sense of responsibility settling in her chest. Elsewhere in the city, Officer Halstead sat in his own home, staring at his reflection in the darkened window. He replayed Malia's words over and over in his mind. "Your actions have consequences." For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to question his own behavior, not just from that day, but from years of patrolling with a sense of unchecked authority. It was an uncomfortable feeling, one that gnawed at his pride. But it was there, undeniable and insistent. The next morning, as the sun rose over the city, Malia returned to the sidewalk where her mural had once been. The chalk was gone, washed away by time and weather, but the space still felt alive with possibility. She crouched down, opening her box of chalk, and began to draw again. This time she worked with an even greater sense of purpose. As the vibrant colors came to life beneath her hands, neighbors began to gather, offering words of encouragement and admiration. And somewhere, perhaps unseen but deeply felt, the seeds of change began to take root. Malia had spoken her truth, and the world, however slowly, was starting to listen.